हेलो दोस्तों, कैसे हैं आप सभी लोग। आपको इस वीडियो का बहुत लोगों को इंतजार था इस वीडियो का। चैप्टर 2 आपका एम्बर स्टार्ट करेंगे, एम्बर कब ख़त्म करेंगे। तो आज से फिर हम फिर से एम्बर अपनी रेगुलर स्टार्ट रखेंगे। आपको उसकी रेगुलर वीडियोस मिलती आएंगी। बस आप उसको ज़्यादा से शेयर करिए, लाइक करिए, कमेंट करिए और मेरे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करिए। अभी अगर आप चैनल सब्सक्राइब नहीं किया तो प्लीज़ सब्सक्राइब करिए और वो नोटिफिकेशन वाला बेल को आइकन को दबा दीजिए कि आपके पास हर नेक्स्ट वीडियो का नोटिफिकेशन आता रहे। तो ये बिना किसी देरी के स्टार्ट करते हैं। ये चैप्टर थोड़ा लंबा हो सकता है, अगर ज़रूरत लगी तो उसको हम 5 मिनट अपलोड करेंगे। अगर 1 मिनट पर हो जाता है तो इसको हम एक ही वीडियो में अपलोड कर देंगे। आइए स्टार्ट करते हैं। रिसर्च मेथड्स इन एंथ्रोपोलॉजी। व्हाट आर द रिसर्च मेथड्स वी टॉक अबाउट, हाउ दे ब्रिंग रिसर्च. So it's a picture of anthropologist who is just went to the tribe on the field work, and the persons of tribe that explaining him whatever their culture, how their festival or whatever they're doing. So let's start. The intellectuals who developed since the mid 17th century they understood very well that human knowledge, the words could be biased and incomplete. So rather than be rejecting the possibility of objecting understanding, the founders of science just created a way of generating understanding based on the rigorous taking of testing of ideas as anthropological physics, as a Philip Salzman explains. And the scientific method, the heart of science, was invented because of it was understood that human error was wish fulfillment, duplicity, and dishonesty, and weakness could commonly distort research findings. Exactly, the scientific requirement that the procedures of the studies must be specified in detail so that others could repeat them, and the actual application of findings by other scientists in other venues establishing the immense the dictionary effects of human subjectivity and the moral weakness of the quest for knowledge. सिस्टम गड़बड़ ना रही, सबको सही नॉलेज, गड़बड़ अगर नॉलेज हो जाती है, कुछ गलत लिखता है तो आगे सब साइंटिस्ट को समस्या होगी. Although one goal of anthropology is to understand what is mean to mean a human or different culture context, a goal for which science and pursuit of explanation not appropriate. Most anthropologists believe that objective knowledge about culture is possible through science. Now, explanations. What is explanation? Explanation is an answer to why question. In a science, there are two kinds of explanation that researchers try to achieve: variations, association, and theories. Variable, a thing or quantity that varies. What is law? Law in scientific term is the association or relationship that almost all scientists accept. Start explanation. Explanation is an answer to a why question. There are many types of explanations, some more satisfying than others. But for example, suppose we ask why a society has a long postpartum sex taboo. We could guess that the people in the society want to abstain from sex for a year after the birth of a baby. Is this explanation? Yes, because it does suggest that people have a purpose in practicing the custom. Is therefore partly answer the why question. But such an explanation wouldn't be very satisfying because it doesn't specify that what the purpose of a custom might be. How about the idea that people have a long postpartum sex taboo because it is their tradition? That too is an explanation, but it is not satisfactory for an efficient. It is not for a different person, different reason. It is tautology. It is tautology, that is the thing to be explained. The taboo is being explained by itself, by its prior existence. To explain something in terms of tradition is to say that the people do it because they already do it, by which is not informative. What kinds of explanation is more satisfactory? Then in science, investigators try to achieve the two kinds of explanations: associations and theories. Associations or relationships. One way of explaining something as an observation, an action, or a custom is to say that how it conforms to a general principle or relationship. So to explain why the water left outside the basin froze, we say that it is a cold last night and the water freezes at 32 degree Fahrenheit, 0 Celsius. The statement that water solidifies becomes ice at 32 degree Fahrenheit is a statement of a relationship of association between two variables, things or quantities that vary. In this case, what happened, that variation in the state of water, liquid versus solid, is related to of variations in the temperature at this air. Below, above versus 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the truth of the relationship is suggested by the repeated observations in the physical sciences. Such relationships are called laws. When almost all scientists accepted them, we find such explanations satisfactory because they allow us to predict that what will happen in the future, to understand something about happened regularly in the past. In the social science, firstly I would pick up the picture. The statement that water becomes ice at 32 degree Fahrenheit or 0 degree Celsius defines an association between two variables, and water and temperature, these are both other different separate associations. There is a relation between the two associations, water and temperature. They are related to each other. The theory explains why they as an associate exists. In the social sciences, associates are usually stated as probabilistically. That is, they say that two or more variables tend to related in a practical way, which means that there are usually some exceptions. For example, to explain why a society has a long postpartum sex taboo, we can point out to the association or correlation that John Whiting found in a worldwide sample of society. Society will apparently low protein diets tend to have long postpartum sex taboo. We call the relationship between low protein diets and the sex taboo is a statistical association, which means that observed relationship is unlikely to be due to chance. Now, statistical association means a relationship or correlation between two or more variables that are unlikely to be due to chance. कोई यहाँ पे कन्फर्मेशन नहीं किया क्योंकि बाई चांस हो सकता है, कोई कैसे नहीं अंदाजा हो गया, कोरिलेशन हो गया. And theories का क्या सीन होता है कि theories ही talking about there are theories that even though the laws and statistical association explain by relating, that is why to explain other things, we want to know more why those laws and associates exist. Why does water freeze at 30 degree Fahrenheit? Why do societies and with low protein diet tend to have long postpartum sex taboos? Therefore, scientists try to formulate to theories that will explain the observed relationships, laws and statistical associations. Theories explanation of association or laws. Theories known as explanation of laws and statistical associations are more complicated than the observed relationships which are intended to explain. It is difficult to precise about what a theory is. By way of example, let us return to the question that why some societies have a long postpartum sex taboos. We have already seen that it's a non-known statistical association can be used to help explain it. If a society has a long low protein diet, it will generally have a long postpartum sex taboo. But most people would ask an additional question that why does a low protein diet explain the taboo? What is the mechanism by which a society with such a diet develops the custom of a long postpartum sex taboo? A theory is intended to answer such question. John Whiting theorized that a long postpartum sex taboo may be an adaptation to certain conditions, particularly in tropical area where the major food staples are low in protein. Babies are vulnerable to the protein deficiency disease called kwashiorkor. But if a baby could continue to a nurse for a long time, it might have a more of a chance to survive. The postpartum sex might be adopted. That Whiting's theory suggests that because it increases the likelihood of baby survival, that if a mother puts off having another baby for a while, for the first baby might have a better chance to survive because it can be fed mother's milk for a longer time. Whiting suggests that the parents may be aware that whether unconsciously or consciously that having another baby too soon might jeopardize the survival of the first baby, and so they might decide that abstaining from intercourse for more than a year after the birth of the first baby would be a good idea. As this example of a theory illustrates that there are the differences between a theory and association. A theory is usually much more complicated, containing a series of statements. An association usually states quite simply and that there is a relationship between two or more measurable variables. Another difference is that although a theory may mention some things that are observable, such as the presence of a long postpartum sex taboo, it contains other concepts or statements that couldn't be observed. For example, with regard of the Whiting's theory, it would be difficult to find out if the people who adopted the custom for a long postpartum sex taboo had some awareness that babies would thereby have a better chance to survive. Then too, the concept of adaptation, that some characteristic promotes greater reproductive success, is difficult to verify because of the challenge of finding out whether different individuals or groups have different rates of reproduction. Because they do or do not practice the supposedly adoptive custom, thus some concepts or implications in the theory are unobservable, at least at the present time, and only some aspects may be observable. In the contrast, statistical association or laws are based entirely on the observations. Why theories cannot be proved? Many people think that the theories they learned in physics or chemistry course have been proved. Unfortunately, many students get the impression because their teachers present lessons in an authoritative manner. Scientists and philosophers of science now generally agree that no theory can be said to be proved or unquestionably true. Although some theories may have considerable evidence in supporting them, it is because many of the concepts and ideas of theories are not directly observable and therefore not directly verifiable. For example, scientists try not to explain how light behaves as a postulating that it consists of particles of called photons, but photons cannot be observed even with the most powerful microscope. So exactly what a photon looks like, exactly how it works, remain in the realm of the unprovable. The photon is a theoretical construct. Theoretical construct is something that cannot be observed or verified directly, because all the theories contains such construct theories that cannot be proved entirely or with absolutely certainty. So why should we bother with theories then? If we cannot prove that they are true, perhaps the main advantage of a theory is a kind of explanation is that they may lead to a new understanding or knowledge. A theory can suggest new relationships or imply new predictions that might be supported or confirmed by new research. For example, Whiting's theory about long postpartum sex taboo has implications and researchers could investigate. Because the theory discusses how a long postpartum sex taboo might be adoptive, we would expect that certain changes would result in the taboo's disappearance. For example, suppose people adopted either mechanical birth control devices or began to give supplementary high protein foods to babies. With birth control, a family could space birth without abstaining from sex. So we would expect that custom of postpartum abstinences to disappear. Additionally, we would expect it to disappear with protein supplements for babies because kwashiorkor would then be less likely to afflict the babies. Whiting's idea might also promote investigators to try to find out whether parents are consciously or unconsciously aware of problem of close birth spacing in areas with low supply of protein. Although theories cannot be proved that they are rejectable, the method of falsification means showing that the theory seems to be wrong by finding that implications or predictions derivable from it is not consistent objectively correct data. The method of falsification which shows that the theory seems to be wrong in the many way that theories are judged. Scientists derive implications or predictions that should be true if the theory is correct. So for example, Whiting predicted that societies with long postpartum sex taboo would be found more than often in the tropics than in temperature region, and that they would be likely to have low protein food supplies. Such predictions or might be found as a called hypothesis. Hypotheses known as predictions, which may be derived from the theories about how variables are related. If the predictions turn out not to be correct, the researcher is obliged to be conclude that something may be wrong with the theory or something wrong with the test of the theory. Theories that are not falsified are accepted for the time being because the available evidence seems to be consistent with them. But remember that no matter how much the available evidence seems to be support a theory, we can never be certain it is true. There is always a possibility that some implication of it, some hypothesis derivable from it, will not be confirmed in the future. A brief history of anthropological theory. Joint theory. John Whiting's theory explaining why long-postpartum sex taboo might be adoptive is the only one of the main theories that anthropologists employ in their research. The history of anthropological reflects broad themes with the types of theories anthropologists have used. Whiting's theory, for example, can be placed with the body of ecological theories. Let's take a look at some of the variety of theological observation orientations that have been important to the anthropologist. Theoretical orientation. What is theoretical orientation? The general attitude about how phenomena are to be explained. Early evolutionism. What is the theory of evolution? Had a strong impact on anthropology in the 19th century. The prevailing view was the culture internally develops or evolves in a uniform and a progressive manner, just as Darwin argued species did, and it was thought that the most societies pass through the same series of stages to arrive ultimately at a common end. Two 20th century anthropologists whose writing exemplified the theory that culture generally evolves uniformly and progressively were Edward B. Tyler (1832 to 1917) and Lewis Henry Morgan (1818 to 1881). Both maintained that culture evolved from the simple to the complex, and that all societies pass through the three basic stages of development, from savagery through barbarism to civilization. Progress was therefore possible for all. From slavery to savagery through barbarism to civilization. Progress was therefore possible for all. To account for cultural variations, Tyler and Morgan postulated that different contemporary societies were at different stages of evolution. According to this view, the simpler peoples of the day had not yet reached the higher stages, through important at the beginning of the anthropological evolution of Tyler Morgan is largely related today. Race theory. Evolutionism also influenced that another branch of early anthropological theory, one that posited that the reason human culture different in their behaviors was because they represented separate subspecies of humans or races. This idea was influenced by the fact that 19th century at least it became clear that few cultures were being civilized in the way Europeans expected. Rather than attribute this to strength of cultural traditions, some attributed to the innate capabilities of people. In other words, to their race. Members of uncivilized races were by their very nature incapable of being civilized. Such ideas were widely held during the late 19th century and 20th centuries, and American anthropologists play a large role in showing that race theory was unsupported in a variety of contexts. Unfortunately, race theory persists in some disciplines. Bayesian anthropology, the beginning of 20th century, brought the end of evolutionism range in American anthropology. Its leading opponent is Franz Boas, whose main disagreement with the evolutionists that involved with the assumption of universal laws governed by all human culture. Bose pointed out that 19th century armchair anthropologists lacked sufficient data to formulate many useful generalizations. Bose also strongly opposed that race theory and made significant contribution to the study of human variation and demonstrated how supposedly racial characteristics actually vary depending on where a person grew up. Bose stressed and the idea that single cultural traits had to be studied in the context of society which they appeared. According to the method he advocated, the essence of the scientist science is to mistrust all expectation, is to rely only on facts. But as we argue in this chapter, collecting data without some preliminary theorizing, without ideas about what to expect, is problematic. For the facts that are most important may be ignored, whereas irrelevant one may be recorded. So Bose, concerned with innumerable local detail, did not encourage to believe that might be possible to explain the major variation in culture. By the 1950s, many anthropologists felt that Boasian focus on describing culture rather than explaining how and why culture varied limited the scope of anthropology. Two main approaches of anthropology emerged from the movement away from the description: ecological and interpretive. Ecological approaches Ecological was just Julian Stewart in 1992 to 1972 was one of the first to advocate the study of cultural ecology. What is cultural ecology? The analysis of relationship between the culture and its environment, known as cultural ecology. The Stewart felt that the explanation for some aspects was one of the first to advocate the study. Julian Stewart, he Stewart that felt that the explanation for some aspects of cultural variation could be found in the adaptation of societies to their particular environments. Cultural ecologists assume that cultural adaptation involves the mechanism of natural selection for more frequent survival and reproduction of the better adapted environment, including the physical and social environments. Affects the development of cultural traits in the individuals of populations behaving in certain different waves have different degrees to success, survival, reproduction of consequently in the transmission of their ways of behaving from generation to generation. Today's anthropologists who refer to themselves as evolutionary or behavioral ecologists as opposed to cultural ecologists explore how particular characteristics may be adopted for an individual in a given environment. Cultural ecologist tends to focus on a group or culture more than the individual. Adoptive means the ability of individuals to get their genes into and future generations. This viewpoint implies that behavior is transmitted in some way by genes for learning to people who shares your genes, usually offsprings. If a certain behavior is adopted for individuals in a particular environment or a particular historical context in which these individuals are able to reproduce more than others, it should become more widespread in future generations. As the individuals with those traits increase in number, one important contemporary idea, dual inheritance in theory, was given such more weight to the culture as part of the contemporary as an evolutionary process. Dual inheritance refers to the both genes and culture playing different but nonetheless important and interactive roles in transmitting traits to future generations. Current research and issues were going on evaluating alternative theories. Here in working among the abelium of the New Guinea record skeleton puzzle were invested so much energy in growing the giant ceremonial yams and sometimes more than 10 feet long. Also, why do we abstain from sex for 6 months while they grow them? Of course, they try to understand. We need to know how much about the abelium way of life. Scaglian had read about them and lived among them and talked to them, but as many ethnographers have discovered, answers why questions don't just leap to answer. Answers, at least tentatives, often come from theological orientation that suggests that however we where looks were answers. Scaglian considered several possibilities, as Donald Tuzen had suggested for a nearby group, the plains approach yams to be symbols of stand for shared culture and understanding. Look at for the meaning of symbols is a kind of interpretive approach of ethnological data. The abelian think of yams as having souls that appreciable tranquility, and yams also have the family lines at marriage, and joining of family lines is symbolized by planting different yam lines in the same garden. During the yam growing cycle, remember the yams appreciate tranquility, lethal warfare and conflict before become channeled and mostly with the competitive but non-threat yam growing contest. So yam growing may be functional as a sense that help to foster harmony. Then again, ceremonial yam growing may be adaptive ecological consequences, just as the Sembaga big feast seem to be keep human population in the line in sources. Caglian thinks that the ceremonial yam growing did too. Growing pig populations damage gardens and create conflicts, but pigs are also.
It is chapter 5, working of constitutions. It's an overview that democracy is not just about people electing their rulers. In a democracy, the rulers has to follow some rules and procedures. They have to do work within the institutions. This chapter is about the working of such institution in democracy. We try to understand this by looking in a manner in which major decisions are taken and implemented in our country. We also look at how disputes regarding these decisions are resolved. In this process, we come across the institution to play a key role. You may have already read something about these institutions in earlier classes. We shall quickly summarize those and move on the asking the larger questions. In the case of each institution, we ask what does this institution do? How is the institution connected to other institutions? What makes its functioning the more or less democratic? The basic objective here is to understand how all the institutions together carry on the work of government. Sometimes we compare these with similar institutions in other democracies. In this chapter, we will take our examples from the working of national level government, called central government, union government, and can think of discuss and or just government of India. And while reading the chapter, you can think of and discuss examples for the working of the government in your state. How is a major policy decision taken? A government order. On August 13, 1990, a government of India issued an order. It was called an office memorandum. It is called an office memorandum. Like in all government orders, it has a number and it's owned by that OM number and estimated at STT rated at whatever it is, and joint secretary and officer in the Department of Personnel and Training in the Ministry of Personnel and Public Advances Pension signed the order. It was quite short, barely one page. It looked like an ordinary circular of a notice that you may have seen in the school. The governments issued hundreds of orders every day on different matters, but this one was very important, become a source of controversy for several years. Let us see how decision was taken, what happened. So this is a picture of real. Here it is of reservation. 27% of vacancies of civil posts and services under the government of India shall be reserved for SEBC. Reservation for backward classes in civil posts and services under the government of India regarding. So the order announced a major policy decision. It is said that the 27% of the vacancies in civil posts and services under the government of India are reserved for the socially and economic backward classes. SEBC, socially and economy backward classes. SEBC is another name of all those people who belong to the castes that are considered backward by the government. The benefit of job reservations was till then available, now only for to scheduled caste, scheduled tribes. Now a new third category called SEBC was introduced. Only persons who belong to the backward caste were eligible for this quota, 27% jobs. Other couldn't compete for these jobs. The decision makers who decide to issue the memorandum, clearly such a big decision couldn't have taken by the person who signed that document. The officer was merely implementing the instructions given by the Minister of Personnel, Public Grievances, Pensions, of which department was a part. We can guess that such a major decision would have involved other major functionaries in our government, our country. You have may already heard. Read in the previous chapter classes also read about. Let us go to the you cover them. President is the head of the state and is the highest formal authority of the country. Prime Minister is the head of the government. President is the head of the state and is the highest formal authority of the in the country. Prime Minister is the head of the government and actually exercises all government powers, and he takes most of the decisions of the cabinet meeting. Parliament consists of the two houses, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. The Prime Minister must have the support of a majority of Lok Sabha members. So, were all these people involved in this decision regarding of the office memorandum? Let us find out. This office memorandum was the culmination of a long chain of events. The government of India had appointed a second backward class commission in 1979. It was headed by BP Mandal, hence it was popularly called the Mandal Commission. It was asked to determine the criteria to identify the socially educatorily backward classes in India and recommend steps to be taken for their advancement. The commission gave its report in 1980 and made many recommendations. One of these was 27% of government jobs be reserved for socially and economically backward classes. The report and the recommendations were discussed in the parliament for several years. Many parliaments and parties kept demanding the implementations. For several years, many parliamentarians and parties kept demanding the implementation of Commission's recommendation. Then came the Lok Sabha election in 1989. In its election manifesto, the Janata Dal promises that if voted to power, it would implement the Mandal Commission report. The Janata Dal did the government after this election, formed government after this election, and its leader VP Singh, because the Prime Minister became the Prime Minister, and several developments took place after that. Then after that, President of India in his address to the Parliament announced the intention of government to implement the recommendation of Mandal Commission. On 6th August 1990, Union Cabinet took a formal decision to implement the recommendations. Next day, Prime Minister VP Singh informed the Parliament about this decision through a statement in both houses of Parliament. The decision of the Cabinet was sent to the Department of Personnel and Training. The senior officers of the department drafted an order in line with the Cabinet decision and took the minister's approval. An officer signed the order on behalf of the Union government. This was the OM number, or this was born 13 August 1990. For the next few months, this was a mostly hotly debated issue in the country. Newspapers and magazines were full of different views and opinions on this issue. It led to the widespread protests. And counter protests, some of which were violent. People reached strongly because this decision affected thousands of job opportunities. Some felt that existence of inequalities among people of different castes in India. Some felt the existence of inequalities among different castes of India and that necessitated job reservations की जरूरत दिखाई. They felt that this would have give a fair opportunity to those communities who so far had not adequately been represented in government employment. Others felt that this was unfair as it would deny equality of opportunity for those who did not belong to backward communities. They would be denied jobs even though they could be more qualified. Some felt that this would perpetuate caste feeling among people and hamper national unity. In this chapter, we wouldn't discuss that whether the decision was good or not. We only take this example to understand that how major decisions are taken and implemented in the country. Who resolved this dispute? The Supreme Court and the High Courts in India settled disputes arising out of government decisions. Some persons associations opposed to this order filed a number of cases in the courts. They appealed to the courts to declare the order invalid and stop its implementation. The Supreme Court of India bunched all these cases together. This case was known as the Indra Shawnee and other versus Union of India case. I'm once again repeating, it's a very important case. Indra Shawnee others versus India Shawnee and others versus Union of India case. 11 judges of Supreme Court heard arguments of both sides. By a majority, the Supreme Court judges of 1992 declared that this audit of the government of India was valid, and at the same time, the Supreme Court asked the government to modify its original order. It said that well-to-do persons among the backward classes should be excluded from the getting the benefit of reservation. Accordingly, the Department of Personnel and Training issued another office memorandum on September 8, 1993. The dispute thus came and policy has been followed since then. Now, need for political institution. We have seen an example of how the government works. Governing a country involves various such activities. For example, the government is responsible for ensuring security to its citizens, providing facilities for education, health to all. It collects taxes, spends the money thus raised to the administration, defense, and development programs. It formulates and implements several welfare schemes. Some persons have to take decisions on how to avoid the tax activities. Others have to implement these decisions. If disputes arise in these decisions or in their implementation, then there should be someone to determine what is right or what is wrong. It is important that everyone should know who is responsible for doing what it is. It's all important that these activities keep taking place even if the persons in key positions change. So to attend to all these tasks, several arrangements are made in all modern democracies. Such arrangements are called institutional. Democracy works well when these institutions perform functions assigned to them. The constitution of any country lays down basic rules or powers and functions of each institution. In the example above, we saw several such institutions at work. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet are the institutions that make all the important policy decisions. Once again, I am repeating that Prime Minister and the Cabinet are the institutions which make all the important policy decisions. The civil servants working together are responsible for taking steps to implement the minister's decisions. Supreme Court is an institution where disputes between citizens and the governments are finally settled. So can you think of some other institutions that are of the example? What is their role? Working with institution is not easy. Institutions involve rules and regulations. This can bind the hands of leaders. Institutions involve meetings, committees, and routines. This often leads to delays and complications. Therefore, dealing with institutions can be frustrating. Dealing with the institutions can be frustrating. One might feel that it much better than to have one person take all decisions without any rules, procedures, and meetings. But that is not the spirit of the democracy. Some of the delays and complications introduced by the institution are very useful. They provide an opportunity for a wider set of people to be consulted in any decisions. Institutions make it difficult to have a good decision taken very quickly, but they also make it equally difficult to rush through a bad decision. And that's why democratic government insists to institutions. The institution of the biggest institution of very important institution is the parliament. In the example of the office of memorandum, you do remember the role of the parliament? Perhaps not. That since the decision was not taken by the parliament, you might think that the parliament had no role in it. But let us go back to the story, see whether parliament figures in it. Let us recall the points made earlier, completing the following sentences. The report of the Mandal Commission was discussed. The president in the parliament, the president of India mentioned this is in his parliament speech. The prime minister made a memorandum for a parliament. The decision was not directly taken in the parliament, but parliamentary discussion on the report influenced and shaped by the decisions of the government. They brought pressure on the government to act. on the Mandal recommendation. If the parliament was not in favor of the decision, the government couldn't have gone ahead with it. Can you guess why? Because recall what you read about the parliament in the earlier class. Try to imagine what the parliament could have done. It didn't approve the parliament could have done if it did not approve of the cabinet decision. Once again, I am reading this. Recall what you read about the parliament in the earlier class and try to imagine that what the parliament could have done if it did not approve of the cabinet decision. Why do we need a parliament? In all democracies, an assembly of elected representatives exercises supreme political authority on behalf of the people. Okay. In India, such as National Assembly of Elected Representatives, is called Parliament. In India, such as National Assembly of Elected Representatives is called Parliament. At the state level, is called Legislature or Legislative Assembly. The name may vary in different countries, but such an assembly exists in every democracy. It exercises political authority on behalf of the people in many ways. Parliament is the final authority for making laws in any country. Parliament is the final authority to making laws in any country. This task of lawmaking or legislation is so crucial that these assemblies are called legislatures. The task of lawmaking or legislation is so crucial about these assemblies are called legislatures. Or parliament legislation was okay. Sorry. Legislatures. Parliaments all over the world can make new laws, change existing laws, or abolish existing laws, and make new ones to their place. Parliaments all over the world exercise some control over those who run the government. In some countries like India, this control is full, direct, and full. Those who run the government can take decisions only so long as they enjoy support of the parliament. Parliament control all the money that governments have. In most countries, any the public money can be sent only when the parliament sanctions it. Parliament is the highest forum of discussion and debate on public issues and national policy in any country.
Confident about the theory that replication is need to be confirmed whether the other researchers can reproduce the prediction using the other samples. Other predictions should be derived from the theory to see if the theory is if they to the supported, then theory should be pitted against the alternative explanation to see which theory works better. We may have to be combined theories if the alternative explanation also predict the relationship in question. The research process in science that requires time, patience, and perhaps most important requires the researcher to be humble. No matter how wonderful one's own theory seems, it is important to acknowledge that it may be wrong. If we do not acknowledge the possibility, we cannot be motivated to test our theories. If we don't test our theories, we can never tell the difference between a better or a worse theory. And if we be able to settle forever or present time in ignorance in science and knowledge or other understanding and explaining explained variation. Thus, if we want to understand more, and we have to keep testing our beliefs against sets of objective evidence in the conduct of beliefs. Types of research in anthropology. Anthropologists use several methods of conduct research. Each have certain advantages and disadvantages, generating testing explanations. The types of researching in anthropology can classify according to the two criteria. One of is the spatial scope of the study. The example, the analysis of the single society, analysis of societies in a region, or analysis of a worldwide sample of society. The other criterion is the temporal scope. First, the spatial scope, the temporal scope study, which means historical versus non-historical. Combination of these criteria are shown in table number 2. In this section, we will mostly discuss the researcher strategies in cultural anthropology. However, most of these have parallels of anthropology. Biological anthropology, table 2 makes clear. Archaeology and biological anthropology have special methods. Biological and archaeological anthropology have made special methods, and we devote the last section of the chapter to some of those methods. Ethnography. About the beginning of the 20th century, anthropologists realized that if they were to produce anything to scientific value, they would have to study their subject in the depth. To describe cultures more accurately, they started to live among the people they have ever studied. They observed that even took part in the important events of those societies are carefully questioned people among their native customs. This method is known as a participant observations. Participant observation always means that living among the people being studied, observing, questioning, and when the taking the part in the important beats of the group. So, participant observation always involved field work, which is first-hand experience with the people being studied. But the field work may also involve other methods such as conducting a census or a survey. Field work, the cornerstone of the modern anthropology. Fieldwork is the cornerstone of the modern anthropology. Is the means by which most anthropological information is obtained, regardless of other methods that anthropologists may use. Participant observation conducted usually for a year or more is regarded as fundamental. So now fieldwork is the first-hand experience with the people being studied, and the usual means of information can be grabbed and involves participant observation for an extended period of time. Here is single case to every scope, single case and non-historical and the historical. Single case reason worldwide sample here written over here. Cross-culturally, single case in the ethnological fieldworks and ethnohistory. Archaeological site excavation, there is cultural history. So this type of differences were here you can see. All of these can also involve comparison research settings. Fundamental. He, in contrast to casual description of travelers and adventurers, anthropologists' descriptions record, describe, analyze, and eventually formulate a picture of the culture, at least part of it. So, after doing field work, an anthropologist may prepare an ethnography, a description of analysis of a single society. How an anthropologist goes about that doing long-term participant observation in another culture, and more important, doing well, and it is not straightforward. So much of it depends on the person to person, the culture to culture interaction between the two. So, without a doubt, the experience is physically and psychologically demanding, comparable often to a rite of a passage. Although it helps enormously to learn the local language before going, often it is not possible to do so, and so most anthropologists find themselves struggling to communicate in addition to trying to figure out how to behave properly. Participant observation carries its own dilemma. Participating implies that living like the people and who are being studied, trying to understand subjectivity, what do they think and feel while doing what they do. Whereas observations implies a certain amount of activity and detachment. Because participant observation is such a personal experience, it is not surprising that anthropologists have begun to realize that reflecting to their on the experiences and their personal interaction with the people they live with an important part of understanding the enterprise. The essential part of the participant observation process is finding some knowledgeable person who are willing to work with you, and anthropologists call them informants, to help you have interpret that what you observe and tell us you about the aspects of the culture and what you may not have a chance to see or may not be entitled to see. For example, it is not likely that you will see many weddings in a village of 22 people in a year or of tour or field work. So how can you know who will be a good informant? It is obviously important to find people who are easy to talk and to understand that information what you need. But how do you know who is the knowledgeable? But you can't just assume that people you get along with have the most knowledge. Besides, knowledge is often specialized. One person may know much more about some subjects than others. At a minimum, you have to try it with different people to compare what are they tell us about a subject, and if they disagree. How do you know who is more trustworthy or accurate? Fortunately, formal methods have been developed to help anthropologists select the most knowledgeable informants. One method called the known as cultural consensus model, and relies on the principle that those things that are most informants. Anthropologist Nadian Pigan relies on the consensus method. Consensus model relies on the principle that those things that's most infamous that most infamous agrees most informants agrees to probably cultural. After you establish these things appear to be cultural by asking a sample of informants of same question about a particular cultural domain, it will be easy to discover which informants are very likely to give answers that closely match the cultural consensus. These individuals are you best bets to be bet the most knowledgeable in that domain. It may seem paradoxical, but the most knowledgeable and helpful individuals are not necessarily typical individuals. Many anthropologists have pointed out that key informants are likely to be feel somewhat marginal in their culture. After all, why would they want to spend so much time with a visiting anthropologist? Participant observations is valuable for understanding some aspects of culture, particularly with the things that are most public, readily talked about, and most widely agreed upon. But most systematic methods are important to mapping and house-to-house census and behavior observation to example to determine how people spend their time, as well as focused interviews with a sample of moments. Ethnographies and ethnographic articles on particular topic provide much of the essential data. All kinds of studies in cultural anthropologists to make a comparison of societies in a given method, region, or worldwide. Anthropologists would require ethnographic data on many societies. With regard to the goal of a genetic theory, ethnography within its depth, first-hand, long-term observation provides investigation with a wealth of a descriptive method material covering a wide range of phenomena. Thus, it is a may stimulate interpretation about the way different aspects of culture relate to each other and other features of environment. Ethnographers in the field have the opportunity to get to know the context of society's custom by directly asking the people about those customs and by observing the phenomena that appears to be associated with those practices. In addition, ethnographers who develops a possible explanation for some custom can test that hunch by collecting a new information related to it. In this sense, ethnographers are similar to physicians who are trying to understand why a patient has certain symptoms of illness. Although ethnography is extremely useful to generating explanation, a field study of a single site does not generally provide sufficient data to test a hypothesis. For example, an ethnographer may think a particular society practices polygamy, one man married to two women or more women simultaneously because it has more women than men. But the ethnographer could not be reasonably sure that explanation was correct unless the results of a comparative study of sample societies showed that the most polygamous societies have more women men than men. After all, the fact that one society has both these conditions could be historical accidental and rather than a result of some necessary connection between these two conditions. Ethnography is a source material. Ethnography is a valuable source of information for anthropologists on all fields of discipline. Data from ethnographies is particularly useful in cross-cultural research and remains the single best source of information on many aspects of cultures that anthropologists seek to understand. Because undertaking ethnographic research is time-consuming and challenging, however, the available data on particular culture may be several decades of old, and how old then we don't know whether data is still valid or not. The answer lies in how the concept of time is treated with the anthropologists. Changes in fundamental cultural beliefs, customs, or traits have occurred slowly in the most cultures. The fact that explains that why anthropologists use the present tense or so-called ethnographic present in their written observations. It can safely be assumed that general observation will probably hold true whether the ethnographic was written 20 years or 10 years ago. However, anthropologists are also aware that dramatical cultural changes occur when using ethnographic data from several cultures. Anthropologists make sure that all the information was gathered in the same time period and the way the data was considered valid for each of the cultures at the same point of time, and the comparison can be made reliably. Within cultural comparison, ethnographers could be test a theory within one society if they decide to compare individuals, families, and households, communities, or districts. The natural variability of that exists can be used to create simulate a comparison. Suppose we want to verify wedding's assumption with a longer postpartum taboos and survival of baby society with a long protein diet. Although almost all the couples might practice a long postpartum sex taboo because it is customary. Some couples might not adhere to taboo consistently. Some couples might not conceive quickly after the taboo is lifted. So if we would expect that some variation is spacing between the births, if we collected information on the births of each other and the survival outcome of each birth, we would be able to compare survival rates of children between a shorter time after the mother's last pregnancy with those of children born after longer intervals. A significantly higher survival rate of births after long intervals would support Whiting's theory. What if some communities within the theory society had access to more protein than others, and if Whiting's theory is correct, these communities had with more protein should have high survival rates of babies? If there variation in the length of postpartum sex taboo, why the communities more protein should have shorter taboos. So whether or not we can design intellectual test of hypothesis depends on whether we have sufficiency variability and the variables of hypothesis. When we do not often more than not, we can make use of the variation to support within a culture. Ecologists asked to for particular trait. Today, anthropologists who refer to themselves evolutionary, the behavioral ecologists, explore how particular characteristics may be adopted for individual. However, dual inheritance theory gives much weight to cultures. Dual inheritance refers to both genes and culture playing different but nonetheless important interactive roles in transmitting to future generations. Influenced by literacy, so it is very principle in the explanation summarizing. So you have chapter complete. Now we will start up a next chapter very soon, which name is genetic and evolution. Thank you. And if you like my video, please, I have made a lot of efforts. I have put so much efforts, so please like, share, subscribe my channel. Thank you so much.